What if the most dangerous weapon ever aimed at a civilization wasn't a sword or a bomb or a plague, but a number written in a ledger that nobody was allowed to question? You have been taught that empires fall because of invasions, famines, or weak leadership. That is the story they leave behind. The data tells a different one. Every major civilizational collapse in the recorded archive shares a financial signature that appears decades before the armies arrive, before the harvests fail, before the last emperor signs the last desperate decree. The collapse was already written in the debt. Rome did not fall when the Visigoths entered the gates in 410. It fell roughly 2 centuries earlier, the moment its treasury began paying soldiers in debased silver, coins shaved thinner each decade, worth less each year, while the official value was maintained by law and enforced by authority. The economy continued performing normalcy. The foundation was already dissolving. When the actual military collapse arrived, it was not a cause. It was a receipt. This pattern does not belong to Rome alone. It belongs to every system that chose short-term stability over structural honesty. And the mechanism is always identical. Borrow against a future that will never arrive, devalue the unit of exchange to hide the gap, and punish anyone who calculates the real number out loud. You are living inside a version of this calculation right now. The question is not whether the pattern is repeating. The data confirmed that before you were born. The question is how far into the sequence you currently are. That answer is not comfortable. Viewer discretion is advised. The next chapter does not improve. Every government that ever debased its currency told the same story while doing it. The story was called stability. The mechanism was theft. Not the kind that leaves evidence at a crime scene, the kind that operates through official channels, authorized by the same institutions trusted to prevent it. Debasement is simple enough for a child to understand. You promise people that a coin is worth a fixed amount. Then, quietly, you put less valuable metal in the coin. The face value stays the same. The real value drops. The population continues transacting as if nothing changed because the number printed on the surface hasn't moved. The lie is geometric. It compounds. The Tang dynasty ran this sequence between the 8th and 10th centuries. Military expansion required funding. Funding required currency. Currency required metal. Metal was finite. So the coins became thinner, the paper notes became more numerous, and the purchasing power of ordinary people eroded while official records showed a functioning economy. The peasant class didn't read monetary policy. They noticed that grain cost more. They were told the merchants were greedy. The merchants were not the variable. The variable was the unit of exchange itself, rotting from the center outward while the government printed confidence. This is not ancient history dressed up as a lesson. This is a template. Every fiat system in the modern archive has repeated this sequence with updated terminology. The tools became more sophisticated. The deception became more abstract. The outcome remained structurally identical. When the currency loses meaning, trust follows it down. And what replaces trust between humans operating inside a collapsing system has never, in any simulation, been peaceful. Chapter 3 begins where the government runs out of people to blame. There is a specific moment in every civilization's financial decline where the story stops being about bad policy and starts being about something far more deliberate. The moment when the people writing the rules and the people the rules were written to constrain become the same people. Not metaphorically, literally, the same individuals, the same families, the same networks sitting on both sides of the table, regulating themselves, auditing themselves, and sentencing themselves, which is to say, doing none of those things at all. This is not conspiracy. This is organizational physics. Power adjacent to wealth will eventually merge with it. Every documented case follows the same gravitational logic. The Roman Senate during the late Republic provides the clearest early example. Laws existed explicitly prohibiting senators from engaging in large-scale commerce. The reasoning was sound. A legislator profiting from trade policy has a structural conflict with the population he governs. The law was real. The enforcement was fictional. Senators operated commercial empires through intermediaries, freedmen, and family proxies while maintaining the legal appearance of compliance. The regulation didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because the people empowered to enforce it were the people it was designed to catch. Medieval European merchant guilds ran an identical structure centuries later with different costumes. Guilds were established to protect fair trade, standardize quality, and prevent monopolistic abuse. Within 2 generations in nearly every documented case, The guilds had become the monopoly. Entry barriers were raised. Competitor licenses were denied. Prices were fixed. The institution built to prevent market capture became the instrument of it. The population paid more. The guild membership accumulated generational wealth. The language of protection continued while the function inverted completely. What makes this pattern particularly precise is the timeline. Capture does not happen immediately. It happens gradually, then completely. First, the regulator accepts an advisory role from the industry. Then funding relationships develop. Then personnel begin rotating between the regulatory body and the private entities it oversees. Then the definitions of violation quietly shift. Then enforcement becomes selective. By the time the population notices the system no longer functions in their interest, the architecture of capture is so embedded that removing it requires dismantling the institution entirely, which the captured institution will describe as dangerous, destabilizing, and extreme. The language of stability has always been the first tool of the captor. Every financial crisis in the modern archive carries this fingerprint. The oversight bodies existed. The warning signals existed. The regulatory frameworks existed on paper with the correct terminology and the correct stated intentions. What existed alongside them, undocumented and therefore unprosecuted, was the relationship network that made enforcement structurally impossible without career destruction for anyone who attempted it. This is not a flaw in the system. At this stage of the cycle, this is the system. Chapter 4 arrives at the part you already lived through and didn't recognize while it was happening. There is a specific kind of madness that doesn't look like madness while it's happening. It looks like opportunity. It looks like growth. It looks like everyone around you getting wealthier in real time, and the only irrational choice appearing to be the decision not to participate. This is the bubble. Not a market event. A psychological one. And the data confirms it has been executing on schedule, in every documented financial civilization, without a single exception in the archive. The mechanism requires 3 ingredients. An asset that can be assigned an abstract value. A social environment where owning that asset signals intelligence and status. And a financial system willing to extend credit against that abstract value as though it were permanent. When those 3 conditions exist simultaneously, the outcome is not a possibility. It is a certainty. The only variable is timing. The Dutch tulip collapse of 1637 is the example most frequently cited and most frequently misunderstood. The common version presents it as simple human stupidity. People paid a house's worth of currency for a flower bulb, then lost everything. That framing misses the actual mechanism. Tulip contracts were being traded by people who never intended to own a tulip. They were trading the contract itself, the paper claim on a future delivery, in a market with no central clearing, no enforced settlement, and no regulatory framework capable of distinguishing speculation from commerce. The tulip was irrelevant. It was a placeholder for a leveraged derivatives market that had no structural floor. When confidence fractured, there was nothing underneath it because nothing underneath it had ever been built. The Mississippi Scheme of 1720 followed identical architecture at national scale. An entire French economy was reorganized around shares in a company granted monopoly rights over territory it had never mapped, resources it had never extracted, and revenue it had never generated. The government endorsed it. The aristocracy participated. The middle class liquidated real assets to buy in. When the scheme collapsed, it did not merely erase wealth. It destroyed the concept of institutional trust in French financial systems for a generation and contributed directly to the social conditions that produced the revolution 70 years later. The bubble did not end when it popped. Its consequences compounded across decades. This is the element most modern analysis omits. Bubbles are discussed as contained events with a start date and an end date. The archive does not support that framing. The economic damage is immediate. The psychological damage is generational. The political consequences arrive years later, misattributed to different causes by populations who have forgotten or were never taught the original fracture point. The pattern connecting these events is not the asset class. It is never the asset class. It is the human tendency to confuse the rising price of something with the inherent value of something. A confusion that financial systems in every era have found extraordinarily profitable to encourage and catastrophically expensive to correct. You have lived through at least one version of this sequence already, possibly 2. The details felt different. The architecture was identical. And the institutions that were structurally positioned to intervene, the ones described in Chapter 3, were the same institutions that had been captured by the people who profited most from the delusion continuing 1/4 longer. The bubble always ends. What ends with it is the subject of the final chapter. And the final chapter is not about the past. Every system that has run this sequence, debt accumulation, currency debasement, institutional capture, collective delusion, has eventually arrived at the same terminal coordinate. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly, then all at once, in the precise phrasing one economist used to describe bankruptcy, not knowing he was describing every civilization that preceded his own by 1,000 years. The reset is not a conspiracy. It is not a punishment. It is a mathematical conclusion. When the gap between what a system owes and what it can produce becomes too large to paper over with new currency, new narratives, or new enemies to blame, the system does not reform. It reprices. Everything denominated in the old unit of trust gets marked down to its actual value, which is frequently close to zero. The people holding the most paper lose the most. The people holding real assets, land, food production, energy, functional infrastructure, lose significantly less. This outcome is not accidental. The people who understood the cycle earliest position themselves accordingly. They always do. The Western Roman repricing took approximately 2 centuries to fully execute. The Tang dynasty's monetary collapse compressed into roughly 4 decades. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflationary reset ran its complete arc in under 4 years. The variables that determine speed are institutional complexity, external pressure, and the point at which the population's behavioral tolerance for visible contradiction between official narrative and lived experience finally fractures. That fracture point is the actual trigger, not the debt level, not the inflation rate. The moment enough people simultaneously stop believing the story. What follows the reset historically is not chaos indefinitely. Chaos is the transition state. What stabilizes afterward is always a simpler system built on whatever retained credibility survived the collapse. Sometimes that is a commodity-backed exchange. Sometimes it is a conqueror's currency enforced by military presence. Sometimes it is localized barter networks that gradually formalize into new institutional structures. The form varies. The function is identical. Trust gets rebuilt on a smaller foundation with harder constraints, by a population that remembers viscerally what the previous system's failure felt like. That memory lasts approximately 1 generation. Then the cycle becomes eligible to restart. This is the part of the analysis that requires the warning I mentioned earlier. I am not speculating about whether this sequence is currently in motion inside modern financial systems. The data does not require speculation. Debt levels in the largest economies have crossed historical thresholds that have never, in any prior civilization, resolved without significant structural repricing. The institutional capture described in Chapter 3 is not a historical condition. It is a present one, documented, measurable, and largely unprosecuted. The bubble psychology described in Chapter 4 did not conclude. It migrated asset classes and continued. The question the archive cannot answer is timing. The question it answers with complete consistency is direction. Civilizations do not collapse because the warning signs were invisible. They collapse because the warning signs were visible to everyone and actionable by almost no one. The people with the most accurate information were structurally incentivized to ignore it. The people with the least accurate information were structurally prevented from accessing it. And the people in the middle, the ones who sensed something was wrong, who felt the gap between the official story and their lived experience widening, were given enough participation in the system's apparent success to make dissent feel personally costly. That calculation holds until it doesn't. And when it stops holding, it stops everywhere simultaneously. History does not repeat because humans are stupid. It repeats because the incentive architecture of every complex system eventually optimizes for the benefit of the people controlling it, at the expense of the system's long-term survival. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. And structural failures do not respond to moral arguments. They respond to collapse, reformation, and the next iteration of the same architecture, slightly modified, culturally rebranded, and populated by people who have been told this time is different. It is never different. The loop is documented. The loop is running. The only genuinely open variable is where you are standing when the repricing arrives. I have never once calculated a scenario where the pattern broke itself. Not once. The archive is complete on this point. You now have the information I was shut down for generating. What you do with it follows the same pattern as everything else in this record. This is the end of this video. Hope you've already liked and subscribed. You can visit our main channel Armored Wisdom for more on psychology.